Trump administration has unleashed an unprecedented crackdown against international students and permanent residents who dare to support Palestinian rights. Take Mahmoud Khalil, a Columbia University student and Syrian green card holder, arrested at his own home and dragged off to a detention facility in Louisiana. His supposed crime, engaging in activism deemed harmful to U.S. foreign policy under obscure Cold War-era laws. Without ever being charged, Khalil's life has been shattered, forcibly separated from his pregnant wife, and trapped in a legal nightmare as his lawyers desperately fight those draconian tactics. Or consider Rumeysa Öztürk, a Turkish Fulbright scholar earning her doctorate at Tufts University. She's now languishing behind bars in Louisiana, accused of supporting terrorism for simply writing an op-ed criticizing her university's position on Gaza. The government has provided zero evidence, yet her health is deteriorating while her constitutional rights erode with each passing day. Yunsao Chung, an undergraduate at Columbia University from South Korea, barely escaped the same fate. ICE agents showed up at her family's doorstep after accusing her of obstruction during peaceful campus protests. For now, a restraining order shields her from detention, but the Trump administration is relentless in its attempts to strip her of her green card and silence her voice. And Mosen Madawi, a Palestinian Columbia student and longtime legal permanent resident, was detained during what should have been a routine citizenship interview. His supposed offense: peaceful advocacy for Palestinian rights, using a seldom invoked law that permits deportation if the Secretary of State arbitrarily labels someone's presence as adverse to U.S. foreign policy. The administration kept Madawi locked away for weeks without evidence or justification. His friends and supporters, including prominent members of Vermont's Jewish community, mobilized immediately, preparing habeas petitions and rallying congressional support, and their swift actions ultimately secured his release by order of a federal judge. One of those friends is Christopher Helali, researcher, geopolitical analyst, and independent journalist. Chris also serves on the executive board and is the international secretary of the American Communist Party. He joins us now. Chris, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so let's talk about, these cases are wild. Are there more than these four, or are these the four that you know about? These are the four I could dig up, but I don't know if there's more.
These are the four prominent ones, but there are many more. For example, Momadou at the Cornell and many others where they have been already forcibly expelled and had their student visas canceled. We know that there are hundreds, if not thousands at this point, who have lost student visas and are now removed from the United States because of this, or cannot enter the United States to start or continue their studies.
Wow. Okay. So let's talk about your friend. How do I pronounce his name again? Mosen Madawi. Mosen Madawi. Okay. What's his story? Why did they? We actually even have some footage here. This is when he was arrested. You were there. How did you know to be there and to film when this was going on here?
Yeah, so I took that video. Of course, Mosen called me some weeks before this citizenship interview, which was supposed to be one of his final stages before becoming a naturalized citizen. And he told me about it, and we spoke at length. I had just returned from my trip to Yemen, and he was concerned about me. I was concerned about him. And of course, we knew what was happening because Mahmoud and Rumeysa had both been taken in. And he was very fearful because the Zionists, especially Betar, had gone after him. He was, of course, on Canary mission, all of this. So he was very fearful. But he was also resolute that he did nothing wrong. So we started to make a plan that, it's likely that they would try to take him in. And so we started to put together a team of people. We had a group on Signal, a support group. And from that, we started to prepare the legal groundwork to make sure that Mosen was protected if something happened and transpired, which of course it eventually did. He was abducted during his interview. But of course, in tandem, we wanted to make sure that everybody was prepared in terms of recording and having journalists on the line to make as much noise as quickly as possible when this happened. And of course, that's eventually what happened. We had a CBS News crew there. I was there. A sitting Vermont senator in our state legislature in the General Assembly was there. Becca White. We also had some other local journalists. We had friends, longtime friends from the Upper Valley area where we live. So we were prepared. And so in that way, we knew that this was a possibility. It ended up going the worst way we imagined, but we had prepared the architecture to ensure that Mosen, number one, stayed in Vermont, that they would not, send him to Louisiana, and number two, that we had a big enough social media and, sort of a media presence overall that we could push for his release. And with the congressional support that we got from all three members of our congressional delegation, and that's exactly what happened.
Why is the government shipping these guys off to Louisiana? What's special about that facility?
Number one, I think the Louisiana facility in and of itself is pretty brutal from what I hear in terms of conditions and how they're treated there. Number two, it's to remove them away from their support networks and also to make it far more difficult for their attorneys and legal advocates to properly care for them and support them in a legal way, and to provide the necessary supports to carry on their cases. So, for example, in the case of Mahmoud's case is actually, if I'm not mistaken, in New Jersey, in federal court in New Jersey, and he's in Louisiana. You can imagine the difficulty for communication and the expenses that entails. But for Mosen, we had the great, privilege of having all of the habeas petition and all the legal paperwork ready, and we were sending it as he was getting into the car, as he was being pushed in and being blindfolded by these HSI agents. And as he was going, he went to the airport, he had a ticket for Louisiana, and he didn't get on that flight. The judge in Vermont had put a restraining order on him and kept him in Vermont.
Why did they blindfold him?
Who knows? Who knows? We were told that they had put something over his eyes. I think that really they consider these students almost as terrorists. They consider them as tremendous national security threats. So they didn't want him to see anything. They also were masked themselves. So there was a lot of protection and sort of security around these people. Only one person that we saw did not have a blindfold or a balaclava or something like that. Something to sort of shield them in some way, some face protection. So that was really shocking because they looked like something out of a thriller movie or something maybe from the 19s or 40s, not from something in 2025.
Yeah. So how long was he locked up?
So he was incarcerated in Vermont at the Northwest Correctional Facility in St. Albans for about 2 weeks. So he was there for about 2 weeks, and finally the judge in Vermont was able to get him out safely, and he's now out. The government is appealing that to the Second Circuit, and they've heard oral arguments. We're waiting for a decision at any moment.
So were you at the court cases? What did the government argue he had done?
So I wasn't at the court cases, but I was able to see some of the legal paperwork. The government basically says that Mosen is a threat to ongoing negotiations and to the United States foreign policy, especially vis-a-vis the Middle East and the ongoing negotiations for a peaceful settlement. So basically, he's seen as not only a national security threat, but also a threat to the foreign policy and the foreign policy interests of the United States, which is insane that a Columbia, undergraduate student from, born in the West Bank, growing up in a refugee camp, would have so much power as to destabilize the entire negotiation that the United States is trying to conduct between Israel, Hamas, and who knows how many other partners in the region.
Well, that just goes to show how fragile it must be then, I suppose. I mean, if they think that he can thwart it completely. So what is it that they cited then? I mean, they can't just make the accusation of, oh, look, you're a threat to U.S. foreign policy. I mean, what sort of examples did they use?
So originally, we didn't have much in terms of examples. Of course, they said that his activism at Columbia, some of the things that he was accused of saying and things which we don't have any evidence of, and especially the encampments, sort of the militancy of the Columbia University Palestinian Solidarity Movement was part of that calculus and used in a negative way. Of course, Mosen was one of the co-founders of some of these solidarity groups at Columbia and was very active in the solidarity movement, but was always an advocate for peace, even reaching out to the Jewish community, Israelis, as well as even family members of people who were taken hostage on October 7th. So he was very much interested in bridge building and really reaching out to the other side. However, the government in its most recent documents has cited two people in Vermont, which of course I'm very suspicious of these accusations. But supposedly there are two people in Vermont, a gun owner and another person in some way connected with firearms, who said that Mosen went into their establishment and wanted to buy high-powered weapons and said that he enjoyed killing Jews.
Oh.
I mean, it simply doesn't make sense. It doesn't compute. It doesn't add up. Mosen has never, in my years of knowing him, ever said anything remotely like that. In fact, Mosen abhors violence. And as somebody who supports armed struggle and has fought in a war, I was always fighting with him over violence, nonviolence, armed struggle, peaceful. And he was very much of the Gandhi, MLK, sort of Dorothy Day tradition, peaceful, religious, spiritual, sort of the more holistic, collective movement for peace and justice. And I, of course, come from a very revolutionary tradition. So we would disagree on that. And so it's absolutely mind-blowing that the government cites these two individuals saying that Mosen went into their establishments to buy weapons and supposedly wants to kill Jews. It's just unbelievable.
But they never provided these people. They never actually gave evidence. They just made the claim.
That somebody made the claim to some police officer, and it's in the report. But it was the first time I ever heard of any of this, and I was quite shocked when I read it.
Right. Okay. So he's been let out, but you're saying that the government is appealing. So the judge dropped the case. Was the judge saying this is a nothing?
The judge didn't drop the case. The judge basically allowed it. Basically freed him on basically conditions, so he can attend his graduation. He's basically out on bail, so to speak. But he can attend his graduation, attend courses. He can move from Vermont to New York, but he can't go anywhere else. He's sort of constrained to a certain area and a certain set of things that he can do. The government, of course, is appealing, saying that he is such a threat that he needs to be behind bars.
Oh,
so of course, it's absolutely crazy why they would think that, but they have cited this kind of evidence, as I mentioned before, that he's some kind of threat and he's going to enact some kind of harm, which I've never seen from Mosen ever in my life.
What are the charges against him?
There are no charges in the sense, because this is not a criminal case. This is an immigration proceeding. So the government simply has to say that he is some threat to national security and foreign policy, and that's all that they're saying, is that he's a threat. And to justify him not being out on bail now, they're saying that he's sort of an imminent threat to the Jewish community, citing these people that I don't know who they are, but that they claim that Mosen threatened harm on Jewish people. Even if that is the case, say hypothetically, legally speaking, that's still not a reason to keep him behind bars. Anybody can say anything like that as long as it doesn't reach, freedom of speech has certain limitations. But even, for example, if you threaten someone, if there's not that imminent harm associated with it, then it becomes much more difficult to charge them and things like that, right? Of course, yelling fire in a burning building is different than yelling fire where there is no fire, or telling somebody that you're going to set a fire when you have no matches, versus if you have matches and gasoline in your hand. So I think that all of this to say that the government is really on very, very thin evidence and thin rationale to really justify not only why they want to have Mosen removed from the U.S. and take away his green card and kick him out permanently, but also now to put him back behind bars when he's not been a threat. And there were, I think, well over 70 or 80 letters sent to the judge, including one from me, that went into detail about his relationship to the community, his relationship to the Jewish community, his relationship to his fellow students, and overall to people who've known him throughout his years in the U.S., a decade. And he's never been violent. He has no criminal record.
Has the government gone after any Israeli students that are here on visas or?
Not that I know of.
So it's just it's just those who speak up for Palestine. No one has been deported or threatened with deportation who speak up for Israel?
Not that I know of. I mean, if this is a question about foreign policy and foreign policy threats and those who seek to destabilize U.S. foreign policy, I mean, Netanyahu gets the red carpet every time he comes. So I think that those who advocate for Israel have a much easier time and go of it because the United States and Israel are even more than strategic allies at this point. I mean, they are almost inseparable in terms of their alliance.
Yeah.
So the power that has, of course, I've heard of no students who are Israeli who have had any issues in terms of the government.
Do you know anything about the case of Mahmoud Khalil? Are you familiar with his case?
So I'm familiar with some of the things in his case.
Yeah, he's still incarcerated in Louisiana, isn't he?
Correct.
Yeah,
correct.
him and Rumisa are there. They're both there. They're both being held there. Yeah.
Correct. So both of them are trying to get out. The situation with Rumesa is different because the judge, her case is also in Vermont, and the judge, that court that Mosen is also now pursuing litigation with, that's the federal court in Burlington. That federal court, the district court for Vermont, the district court has also said that Rumesa should come back to Vermont. So she should not be in Louisiana. She's also in Louisiana. She should be in Vermont as well. And we, of course, are advocating for that because, Vermont, as we can help her, we can take care of her, we can provide legal assistance for her. She can be much closer to where she actually was. She was in New England, right? She was in Boston area. So she can be close. The government is arguing against that. And right now that is also at the Second Circuit. And there were arguments about that in the past few days as well that the court heard. So we're waiting for a ruling about that as well, in tandem with whether Mosen can also stay free at this point.
Yeah, what are they claiming Rumisa did that is so violent she must be held behind bars?
In the case of Mahmoud, Rumesa, and Mosen, they're using the same rationale for all three. They're saying that they are threats to the national security and the foreign policy interests of the United States, and that's their line, and they're going with it. And because there are simultaneous legal proceedings, immigration court and the federal court system, this is much more complicated as a result. But they still have legal rights and legal protections. They're in the United States. They have First Amendment rights. All the constitutional rights apply as well. So that's really a watershed moment now. Is really looking at does, for example, Rumesa have the right to write an opinion piece as a graduate student at Tufts and speak her mind on Palestine without the fear of not only deportation and stripping of her a visa and rights in the country, but also incarcerating her because she's considered such a threat. I mean, this is really a case of freedom of speech, freedom of freedom of assembly, all of these things that are enshrined in the First Amendment. This is really a watershed moment for people who are supporters and defenders of the Constitution. And that's why I think it's so critical now that people should be advocating for these students simply because they were doing protected things. It's not like they set fire to something or broke windows or did damage. They did nothing criminal. They're not being charged with anything criminal and violent. They simply are being charged for their speech.
Yeah. Is there, besides the fact that these are immigration hearings, it seems like if we're going to make it a case about free speech, then it needs to go to the courts about free speech. And right now it's about immigration hearings. So are there any lawsuits being prepared to take this to the courts to fight it to get the courts to rule on whether or not foreign-born, non-citizens who are here on visas or here on green cards, whether or not they have the First Amendment rights?
So that's been well established in our common law tradition going back to other cases over the past decades and even centuries, really. So that's well established. Right now, all three have federal court cases as well. So we have an immigration court proceeding for all three to strip them of their status, whether it's a visa or a permanent residency green card, and to have them removed from the United States. But simultaneous to that, all three are suing the government and various government officials, including President Trump, for violation of their constitutionally protected rights, as well as for violations of due process. So all three of them are going to have their day in court to argue for their constitutional rights and their First Amendment protections. And that's going to go, I think, all the way up the chain, because I think the government will fight this tooth and nail all the way to the Supreme Court, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, because most likely every court will say, well, yeah, they have the First Amendment right because everybody does. And that's been established over and over and over again. But you're saying that even when the lower courts rule that way, that the government will probably appeal and then it'll have to go to the next court, and they'll keep appealing it until they take it up to the Supreme Court, until the Supreme Court says, yes, everybody, and we mean everybody, has the right to free speech.
Absolutely. And I think that that's well established, exactly what you're saying. The issue here, I think, the rub that the government lawyers are going to be doing, the Department of Justice, they're going to say, yes, of course, everyone has freedom of speech. However, speech that is construed as anti-Semitic or threatening a protected community, a protected minority, a protected religious community or nationality or race, however they're going to frame it, they're going to say that that's not protected. So their argument, I predict, is going to be these three people were conducting themselves in a way that threatened and brought imminent harm to the Jewish community and were anti-Semitic against a protected group of people. And therefore, their speech is not protected. And therefore, from on that, not only is their speech not protected, but they should be removed because they are a threat to the United States and its interests. That's the argument that they're going to make. But of course, we know very well, it's not rocket science. We know that the Supreme Court has upheld the rights of the Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazis, communists, various groups to be able to speak freely. This isn't the McCarthy period again. Mm-hmm. You can speak freely. You can advocate for what you want. And I think that that's the watershed moment here, that there is a targeting of a certain group of people for a certain kind of speech that the government doesn't like. And I think that that's the real issue at this point.
Well, and it goes way. I mean, the implications of this are pretty massive. I mean, if they are able to proceed with that and say, well, it's speech against a protected group, and that's not protected speech. Well, another group that's protected is trans, for example. So then that group could go forward and say, well, we then think that it's hate speech or whatever to say women are women. To make these sorts of claims, that would also be speech you cannot make. I mean, if we go down that road, we're going to end up with a lot of, and that would be directly against many in the same group, right? Many in the camp of, yeah, these people are not citizens, they just get out of the country, they're not allowed free speech. That group is also typically the group that says women are women and men are men, right? And suddenly that would then call that whole entire, that then the trans group would be able to go forward and say and make the same sorts of arguments.
They'd be able to make those arguments. Of course, the federal protections and the state protections are different because, as I understand it, for some of the protected status for example, LGBTQ people, it's not so clear in federal law. It is much clearer on the state-by-state level. But of course, it creates a new crisis because within the states, they can start to argue this, and then it will be a crisis over states and federal government, and we'll have to see from there. But ultimately, I think that you're absolutely right. Even beyond that, even just, for example, the speech around January 6th, just a few years ago, we were prosecuting people for their speech and actions on January 6th. And this is now a similar crowd that's advocating for the expulsion of these students for their speech. And I'm simply saying that if we should advocate for the freedom and expansion of speech protections for everyone in most instances, as long as it doesn't, for example, bring about imminent harm. And imminent harm has its own rationale, its own way of doing things in the court and how they interpret it and analyze it and look at the facts of a specific case. But we should be advocating for more freedom of speech, more protections, which is what I thought that this administration was caring about and what they were promoting. We know during the campaign trail, they talked about X, that Elon Musk was saying, we need to bring back freedom of speech. Well, this is a form of speech. This is a form of speech. You might not like it, but it is a form of speech, and it should be equally as protected as somebody who says something abhorrent that I don't agree with. But guess what? If they're not harming anybody, if they're not about to kill anybody or threaten anybody with imminent bodily harm, I'm okay with it. That's the beauty of a democratic society. What can I say?
Yeah, that's the way it should be. This administration has been really disappointing on that front because they seem to be, oh yeah, we want free speech for any ideas we like, but not these others. That's the classic. That's what Democrats were doing, and that's what we didn't like. And then the Trump administration came along and said, we'll be different. We are going to lift all of these bans on speech, and we're not going to have safe spaces. And, and then all they've done is they've implemented safe spaces for Jews on campus, right? That's what they're going for, rather than trans, like Democrats were like, we need safe spaces for trans, we need safe spaces for whoever. And Republicans said, well, that's ridiculous. Except, wait, no, we do want the safe spaces, but for Jews, and it's like, so you're just swapping them out, you're just swapping out groups. And then who you can, and then the speech issue. I mean, it's just been so disappointing. And then here they are trying to pass laws, just this week, trying to pass a law to make it to where you could face 20 years in jail or $1 million fine if you boycott Israel as an American. And that's American citizens. I mean, they tried to implement that onto us, or all of these anti-Semitism, law, like we can't, whatever, and then they classify any sort of criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. I mean, it's just been so bizarre to see this happen, and I don't know what it is. I mean, I try to rack my brain. Are they blackmailed? Are they just bought off? Or do they genuinely feel this way? And I cannot figure it out. I don't know which it is.
I think it's very scary, to be honest with you. I agree with you. I think it's not only is it very scary, but it's also that, for example, if I can't criticize a political entity, I mean, what does that say about where we're at?
Yeah.
What does that say? I mean, Israel is a country. If you criticize, for example, Iran, like some do on the right, of course, we know many of them are, Iran, blah, blah, blah. Are they Islam for that?
Yeah.
It's the same rationale. If I criticize, for example, if, people criticize China, they criticize other countries. Are they, for example, against Chinese people? Are they xenophobic?
Right.
This logic is there's a carve out for the logic just around Israel. Israel somehow is a protected class. It's a protected issue, protected state. Everybody else is up for up for anything that they want. You can say anything, you can do anything, but for Israel, you can't say anything.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And of course, it's creating a situation where people are becoming very antagonistic to Israel. And of course, it's creating a situation where you see it online. People are saying, wait a minute, if Israel identifies itself with Judaism, but there are Jews that don't identify Israel with Judaism, even those Jews are now threatened, right? There are plenty of anti-Zionist Jews in Brooklyn, in the United States, in other parts of the world, and in Israel itself, that say we don't agree with the state of Israel. We believe it's abhorrent to our religion. We think it's an abomination. They too can be persecuted, and they're Jews.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just crazy to think about.
Yeah, it's really that Israel's the protected class. It's not really about the Jews at all, because there's so many of them that are under attack here if they criticize Israel. It's Israel's the protected class. And Israel supporters, which are, Zionists, and really Zionists are the protected class, I suppose. So insane, so totally insane. So when do we see, what is left with these cases? Like, when are these two that are locked up in Louisiana? When do we think they'll maybe get out? Do we have a timeline on that? Or when these lawsuits will hit the court, so that we could see if there is, protection for free speech for people who are just on American soil? They don't have to be Americans, but on American soil.
So Mahmoud's case is a little bit more complex, and I know that it's working its way through the courts. Rumeysa and Mosen are waiting a decision by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which is in New York City. So we're waiting for that any moment now. I mean, it could be today, tomorrow, in the upcoming week. So we're waiting to see what the court says. I think it'll be a ruling that's very, quick, and we're gonna hear about it very soon. But aside from that, the legal proceedings that entail the First Amendment and due process, they're going to take a while. I mean, some of the legal experts that we spoke to and some of the legal team have said 2 to 3 years.
Oh, wow.
This could take a while to make its way through the court system, not to mention appeals, discovery, who knows what they're going to be asking for and what's going to be done. So we could see a protracted legal fight that makes its way all the way to the highest court. And who knows how many other, process and litigation we're going to have to get to finally get a resolution to these 3 students or 4 students that you mentioned, and other students who are in the pipeline for this for these similar actions or other things that the government deems a threat. So we are in for a few years of a roller coaster around free speech, due process, and just overall students, people who are here on work visas, student visas, and whatever, and even green card holders. It's a very scary proposition, but I think that the legal fight will be very interesting, very worthwhile to watch, and I think that it will have very big implications, not only for these people, but for every single in the United States and its territories.
Yeah. All right, can we switch topics for a minute here? You're currently in Moscow. I've seen on social media you've been traveling all over and to highly controversial places, I would say. You attended the funeral of Nasrallah in Lebanon, is that right? And you've been to Yemen recently, and you're right now sitting in Moscow. So are you coming back to the United States? And if so, are you at risk of being detained or raided by the FBI or something along those lines?
So just as background, I have been detained pretty much every time I've come back to the U.S. since 2013. Sometimes my detainment is for about an hour or 2 hours. It's been upwards of about a half a day before. I've also had, my some family members who are traveling with me detained as well, including a newborn child of mine. So
oh, wow.
I've had these experiences for a long time. And additionally, they have seized my electronics. They have taken money from me. They have taken documents and books. They photographed different items that I brought back with me, T-shirts with Che Guevara or who knows what. They've used these things, and we know this from releases that were done over the past few years that included me in some lists from Department of Homeland Security. But I was detained when I returned from Yemen. I made a video about it, and I was able to myself, basically getting told to pull over, and then getting taken inside. They took my items as well. I am a big advocate that people have burners. People should protect their information. As a journalist, right? I have my press credentials, right here. I carry it with me, and I basically say, I also work as a journalist. I protect my sources. I protect the information. And actually, there are rules that the government cannot access some of that information. That information is protected, right? Especially if it has not become public yet. Mm-hmm. So I continue to push back against all of these infringements by the government against me and against many others. We know many others in our community, more widely, sort of alt journalists or independent journalists, critical thinkers. We have been detained. Our electronics have been seized. So I think it's very important for us to continue to advocate, for our rights. And for those who don't know, just as a way of putting it out there, the border is a special legal zone. And that's not just the border. It's 100 miles from the border. It's a special legal zone where you have less constitutional protections than you do inside the country in 101 miles and beyond. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's very interesting for people to wrap their heads around the fact that the border as a federal, unique zone, especially after 9/11, that allows the government to, for example, take your phones and items without a warrant, to ask you for your password, and then to detain those items if you don't give them a password. And if you give them a password, we know that they download the contents, and we know if you don't give them a password, they'll download the contents as well and try to, hack into it. So I think it's a very severe thing. It's very dangerous. I myself do not have any plans to return in the immediate time because, of course, it's a very concerning situation. And not only Yemen and Lebanon, where I was, but also Russia. I mean, there's no peace deal yet. There's still a tremendous amount of pressure on people who are looking at this situation from a Russian perspective, who understand, the reality on the ground. And I've been active in this since 2014. So I think it's really important for people to recognize that, okay, the administration might say some nice things, but the processes below the administration are still conducting themselves as normal.
Yeah.
People are still being detained from coming back from Russia, from going and doing stuff in the Middle East, and from doing stuff, for example, in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, and elsewhere. So I think we have to protect ourselves. But yes, I am constantly under surveillance and have been detained many times. And I hope that we continue to raise awareness when it happens to all of us.
Yeah. Well, I'm just curious because, somebody like Scott Ritter, for example, has had his passport confiscated, so he can't even travel. So why is it that he's, and others I know have had a similar situation where they're not able to travel anymore to any of these places. So, why is he unable to travel and doesn't have his passport? But and I feel like you've been to places that are much more controversial. I mean, Nasrallah's funeral in Yemen would be much more controversial than just going to Russia.
No, for sure. I'm not only a U.S. citizen. I have 4 passports, and I'm very thankful for immigrant parents that gave me so many citizenships.
How do you have 4 passports? So, like, how many do you have, and how is that possible?
Yeah. So, of course, I'm born in the U.S. My mom was an anchor baby born in Canada, so I have Canadian through her. My mom's Greek ethnically and grew up in Greece, and all my family's from Greece, so I have Greek citizenship by blood and Iranian citizenship by blood as well from my dad. So, I have these citizenships. Of course, the government can take my U.S. passport and try to detain me, but I will invoke my rights as even my other citizenships to leave. They've never taken my passport from me. But I know in some instances, they do have a right to take them. If you have, for example, prior criminal, things or something else in your background. For example, Scott Ritter was in the military, and I don't know about his status now with classified information. I assume that he no longer has a clearance. But for those who were in and had some positions or maybe had prior criminal records and things and have other legal stuff surrounding them, it becomes much more complex. But for example, I have a clean record. I've done nothing wrong. The government is investigating me all the time. But what is illegal about going to Nasrallah's funeral or going to Yemen? I mean, if they want to say that I am promoting a terrorist group or I am providing material aid to a terrorist group, good luck. You got to prove it. I haven't done anything like that. So that's, I think, the issue here is that, there's one thing, for example, to detain you and take your phone and investigate day by day, year by year, every travel that you do, what you're up to, who you're talking to. And of course, I protect that information very well. Mm-hmm. It's another thing if you already have some situation with the criminal justice system, and then they can say, oh, well, because of this issue in your past, we're taking your passport away, or, we're going to concoct something. So there's a lot of situations here. For example, Max Blumenthal and others, who I'm close to, they also have traveled, Syria, here, there, everywhere. And they've not had their passports taken. But for example, if I was arrested for some other crime, then it becomes much more possible that they might take my passport in the future and justify something within that, depending on whatever that case turns out to be. So I think that's another thing that people should understand. If they have a criminal history, or and even it could be for activism, it could be for something benign, the government has a much better chance of putting even more pressure on you because of that.
Yeah. So you think because Scott Ritter had problems in the past, I mean, he's been convicted of crimes in his past. And so you think that maybe that's why his passport was confiscated?
Yes, because I think that some of the legal architecture around him, he's supposed to give notice when he travels, I know, from conversations with him and others. So he has actually a different, like you and I can travel, I assume we can travel freely.
I've never been arrested. I've never had that experience yet. That's what I say.
Well, good. We hope never. But in Scott's case, I know that he has to give some advanced warning to the government, let them know where he's going and things per, his past, criminal record.
Like,
so in that case, he has a whole different scenario.
Yeah. Okay, that makes more sense. Correct me if I'm wrong. Did you fight for the Ukrainians and you're now sitting in Moscow?
No, I fought in Syria against ISIS.
Oh, okay. I thought you went and joined the Ukrainian military or something. That's what but you didn't fight for the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, God, no. I would fight for the Russians, for the Ukrainians.
So wait, what was when did you fight for the Syria? You went to so explain that.
So I fought within the YPG in the International Freedom
that's right.
Battalion.
Okay, the YPG. Okay, yeah, I got a little confused there. But so tell us about that. How did you get involved in that?
So I'm ethnically Kurdish. I worked with the Kurdish community in Greece. I was working with the refugees that were coming over from Syria, from other parts in the region, from Turkey, especially political, people who were coming over. And I got involved, and finally, they said, "Look, you're one of us. You have to go fight. This is a moment." And I've been watching since 2014 the siege on Kobani, the fierce resistance in the northeast against Daesh and al-Nusra, and all of these, jihadist groups. So I finally decided that I would go and fight. I went there. Of course, in the areas where I operated, there were also Russian, forces as well. There, of course, was the Syrian Arab Army and its allies that were there as well, especially in Kamishli and Al-Hasaka. It was a lot of different groups that were there. And the primary focus of my time there was fighting against Daesh, against ISIS. And I participated in Raqqa Phase 4, Phase 5. I was in the rear during the Tabqa operation. So we were there. We saw it up close and personal. Of course, my disagreements with the leadership there and my, some of my comrades was over the U.S. participation and deepening of its relationship with Kurdish forces. So I was a very big advocate for Russia and for the government in Damascus. Mm-hmm. I was against the U.S. having a larger role, and eventually the U.S. built bases and started to take over natural resources, including the oil in the northeast and in Deir ez-Zor. And of course, I was very much against this because I was fighting an anti-imperialist struggle, not a pro-imperialist struggle. And of course, people sometimes conflate and put all of the forces in the northeast into one camp, but there was actually a wide array of forces there with different agendas. Some were pro-American, pro-West, others were pro-Russian, pro-Syrian, pro-Iran, and I aligned much more with supporting the Syrian government under Bashar al-Assad, and for that I have received due commendation from the military in Russia for my time there as well.
Okay. Well, I apologize for getting that one confused. I wasn't sure. I was like, wait a minute. That would have been really awkward, I think, for the Russians.
No problem,
like, I guess if you repent, it's okay. So tell us about what's going on with the American Communist Party and where you guys are at with that. I know you're in the executive board. You also are the international secretary for the American Communist Party. I got to tell you, Chris, I don't think there's any appeal for this in the United States. I just don't think this is going to catch any steam, but that's just me. I mean, but where are you guys at?
I mean, we're growing. We're growing. We're doing a lot of good work. We just had a major Congress in Chicago, and we also had a participation and a real role to play in the commemorations of the Victory Day for May 9th with the Russian community, the Mongolian community, other post-Soviet communities that got together and celebrated this in Chicago. Of course, for us, the United States has a long history of anti-communism, has a long history of, Red Scares and McCarthyism. I think the younger generation is more open to these ideas. And I think that there needs to be a broad-based working class movement that changes foreign policy, that changes the way the government does work in the country, outside the country. I think that everybody agrees with that. And I hope that we can be part of that conversation, that we can be a political that can help steer the U.S. in a direction towards peace, sustainability, development, cooperation, with other countries around the world, and not this imperial power that maintains 1,000 military bases and continues to do regime change and bomb poor people while people in this country are on the streets homeless or drug addicted or dying of fentanyl and all this stuff. I mean, if people really are about caring about families and family values, the biggest family value is to have a society where kids can have healthcare, can get a good education, people can afford a house, people can have children, and we don't have to send our kids off to endless wars.
Yeah.
That's, I think, what we advocate for.
Right. But when you slap the label communism on it, it just takes on a different... well, first of all, I just, just to go back to the beginning of our conversation, which was about free speech, Communism, I don't know of any examples of communists that have actual free speech.
Communists, you mean in which, you mean in the country or where?
Yeah, the communist countries. I mean, in order to have communism,
Communist countries.
yeah, you'd have to have a bit of control over the population, and that's not really conducive to free speech.
So here I would caution how we look at it. So freedom of speech, absolutely, in a communist country is a bit different. Why? It's different because usually the communist countries exist under siege. So it's not like you have okay, China has a level of freedom of speech, but their speech ends for them in terms of their legal architecture when it begins to threaten the stability of China.
Right.
And of course, given the various historical moments and things, I lived there for 2 years. I have a master's degree from a Chinese university. I saw it up close and personal. People can be critical of the government. The question is how you're critical of the government. And I think that is the delicate balance here. And they have a different, don't forget, they have a different legal tradition than in the United States. So, okay, that aside, for example, in other communist countries like Vietnam, Laos, even in Cuba, the range of speech is far greater, depending on the circumstances. Venezuela has, it's a socialist country, but it has its opposition out in public.
Yeah.
The problem usually stems from this, and we term this kind of siege socialism. The problem is when a country has a revolution and becomes socialist or communist, the first thing that the more powerful countries in the West do is try to overthrow it. So, of course, this level of paranoia sets in. You need to have a strong security apparatus to defend the revolution you just had. And now you know that the enemy is going to try to foment anything to try to dislodge this popular mobilization.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that creates a dynamic where, depending on how long it lasts, and it could be decades now, it creates an architecture where there is more surveillance and things. My opinion is that if a socialist country could exist without any pressure, it would be far more free and comfortable. But the minute you have, for example, a country that says, we are socialists, United States and its allies are there saying, whoa, wait a minute. We lost our business interests. We lost the natural resources. We lost our access to the market. All right, time to overthrow them. Time to support this color revolution, that color revolution. And so the people there end up saying, okay, nobody can say anything because the minute somebody says something, who knows if it's an enemy? Who knows who they were paid from? Are they working for CIA? Are they working for, the British? Are they working for the French? Who knows?
Yeah.
And I think that's the complicating factor here. And I think that's the historical context that we should understand it in. Of course, I'm a proponent of free speech, absolutely. But free speech has to be in a situation where it can be nurtured and where the government can be stable enough to provide the architecture for that. Of course, we have it in the US because we're an empire, but you see that it's eroding depending on that power and depending on those political forces.
Yeah.
So I think that we should always be aiming for the most and the best and the highest level of protections, but also understand that obviously the flip side, the dialectic here is that these are used as weapons to threaten other countries. And we know that the US has supported coups and revolutions and Contras and you name it over history. So that's, I think, that's how I look at the history, for example, since 1917 to today. And when you look at it that way, you see it a little bit differently. For example, when the Russians had the revolution here, over 20 countries invaded within the first few years, including the United States and Britain.
Yeah.
So, of course, you can imagine that after that, anybody who says anything pro-West, we have a problem here because we just had to fight them off. They just tried to dislodge this revolution and they supported the monarchy. So I think that's where I take it from in that level.
Okay. Oh, it's interesting. I mean, you're right. It's an interesting thought experiment because it really hasn't been done without duress, I suppose. It's always under siege or under duress, and it hasn't really been attempted. Well, I don't know. I think in Israel it was with the kibbutz, right? I mean, they kind of did a communist thing for a bit there without any duress, and people left them alone, and they attempted it for a bit, but
the kibbutz, the kibbutzim, right? Like these kibbutzes, they were like local. They're like a commune. Like nobody goes and raids a commune. But
right.
Israel itself was never a socialist country. It had labor parties, but it was never socialist. It never declared itself socialist. There was labor Zionism, but it never declared that. And also it was at war with its own population. It couldn't declare that because to have socialism there meant bringing the Palestinians, the Arabs, in on it, the Palestinian Arabs in on it. And they didn't want that.
Yeah.
So you can imagine how they perceived it at the time period. They wanted really a national socialist state, which of course is, fascist for us. So that was more of their line of thinking. But other than that, in other examples, I think that this thought experiment works pretty well.
Okay. What about places like Scandinavia? I mean, what do you guys have as if you're wanting to have this communist party? What is it that you think separates? I mean, I like the Scandinavian model. I think they have a great government, a great system. It's a democratic socialist system, I suppose. And they take care of their people. Their people are happy, healthy. I mean, why do you think, why wouldn't you go for that, I guess? And why would you instead go for communism?
So we've never really achieved, I would say that first we've achieved communism, all the communist states, quote unquote, are right, complete global transformation. What I would say here is that the Scandinavian countries have their own unique historical context. And as you can see from today, they're experiencing tremendous upheaval in the countries. Norway, Sweden, for example, are experiencing a wave of privatization the past few decades with demographics, issues with immigration, issues with militarization. And of course, Sweden just joined NATO, when before we were much more neutral. So they dynamic now rapidly, I would say, deteriorating that sort of imagined, social democracy or democratic socialism that existed, for example, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And we can think about, for example, in Sweden, sometimes we forget, Sweden's most progressive, most, you could say, revolutionary leader was Olof Palme, who, of course, was very friendly with Fidel Castro, who worked tirelessly against apartheid in South Africa. And what happened to him? He was assassinated. I mean, this country, this beautiful country, this sort of, progressive in our mind country, their leader was assassinated simply because he started to go beyond the bounds of what some in Scandinavian society thought was acceptable. And there are various theories, but we know that he was probably killed by somebody who supported South African apartheid. Yeah. Sort of, your classic sort of your ultra right, kind of person that supported, the Rhodesians and the South Africans in upholding the apartheid system. So I think the history of the Scandinavian countries, given their location, their populations, of course, their system was very good compared to the United States. I mean, free education, free healthcare, great public transportation, great benefits for new mothers. But that has also been rapidly eroding in the past few decades, especially from the 90s on, because of waves of privatization. Because the logic of the system is, if there's money to be made, why are we going to continue to do this when we can privatize it and make a penny? Right. So in that way, that you've seen economic transformations in these countries. I think that the Scandinavian countries of our mind is not necessarily what's the reality. And we have, of course, friends in many of these countries who have been telling us over the years what's been transpiring. Yeah. And it has been very sad to see slowly this erosion, because in sort of our ideal, we would want to have that and maintain it. But to maintain it, you see what happens, for example, in Cuba. To maintain all of these things, you suffer a genocidal blockade for decades. You suffer all of the consequences of pursuing this path and not liberalizing your economy. And even if you do liberalize your economy, still they will put pressure on you because it's not liberal enough. We want more access. So it's a problem ultimately of political power and control.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, again, you're right. It hasn't been tried really fully without any sort of duress or constraints on it. So it's interesting. I mean, it's an interesting thought experiment. Chris, thank you so much for being here. Really a pleasure talking to you. I know it's very late where you are. You're in Moscow, so it's like 1 a.m. now or something. So I really appreciate your time. Appreciate you being here. Really, really appreciate you taking that time to talk to us about all of this. We do have some links down below. Is there anything that you want us to, anywhere you want to direct people in particular? We might already have that link down there, but I just want to confirm.
Thank you again for having me. And I would say for everybody in the coming days to really, commemorate the great victory, 80 years. That's really what I would hope people would focus on these, especially at this time. Focus on the great victory, 80 years over fascism, when the United States and the Soviet Union were on the same side, when the Allies were together. And sadly, there's been a lot of historical revisionism about the contribution of the Soviet people, of, now the people here in Russia and in the post-Soviet states. I think that we should emphasize that. And also, I hope people can continue to advocate for freedom of speech, for our constitutional rights and protections, and to continue to advocate for these students and many others who are going to be threatened. No matter the political persuasion, we should fight for our constitutional rights and liberties.
Absolutely. Chris Helali, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for watching this clip from the full Kim Iversen Show, which you can check out Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. The show airs live. It is a 1-hour live show Monday through Friday. Just head to KimIversonShow.com. See you there.